Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. Let's look at the next slide, please. I will go ahead and start with introductions. My name is Stephanie Zito, and my name sign is Zito. I'm one of the technical assistant specialists here at the National Deaf Center on Post-Secondary Outcomes, or NDC. I will provide a brief description of myself. I am a white female with brown hair pulled back. I'm wearing a teal colored shirt, and I have a dark gray background behind me. And with that, I will let my co-presenter, Zainab, introduce herself.
In my 30s. I have black curly hair, shoulder length, and brown glasses. I am wearing a black and gold shirt with a black jacket, and I'm sitting in a home office with white walls and a bookcase and a floor lamp, which is currently turned off. I am Zainab El-Kebsi, Z. I am the policy counsel at the National Association of the Deaf, the NAD. Back to you.
Wonderful. Let's look at the next slide. We have a few brief housekeeping tasks to look over before we dive into our presentation today. First, let's do an access check. This presentation is offered in American Sign Language with English voice interpreters who are unseen on the screen, but you can hear their voice on audio. We also have captioning available if you click the CC button on your screen. We also have a link provided in the chat box where you can access the closed caption in a separate window where it is more editable there as well. For best viewing, we don't recommend you use a phone or tablet or even a Chromebook. Those devices have very limited options when you're in a Zoom session, when presenters are sharing a PowerPoint. So we recommend using a laptop or desktop computer for optimal viewing. This session is being recorded and live streamed. We will also be posting the recorded version on our website at a later time, so keep your eye out for that. You'll see that the chat box is closed to participants at the moment. NDC will be using that chat box to make announcements and related posts. And we will have a moment for open participation in the chat box, but that will come at a later time. If you're looking for professional development or certificates of attendance, we do offer those. You must remain for the entirety of the presentation, and we keep track of knowing you are here by providing 2 codes throughout this session. You are responsible to make note of those codes that you will later feed into a form in order to receive credit or the certificate. We will be submitting RID CEUs, and for CRC clock hours, you will be responsible to turn in your certificate in order to get those credits. With that, we will begin with the first code.
So we're going to ask you 3 poll questions today. And before we launch the first poll, we will read each question aloud. Poll number 1, what is your current role? Are you an administrator, ADA 504 coordinator, disability services professional, human resources professional, instructor or faculty, student, or VR professional? other. So let's please launch the first poll. So apparently, most members are disability services professionals. We have a mixture of other roles: administrator, 504 coordinator, no human resources professionals, few instructors, students, and as well as others. So thank you for sharing this information. Let me close the poll. Now realize everybody has a role in supporting deaf student success or deaf person success. And we are so happy you are all with all of us today to get into this information. Next slide, please. You might be curious as to what the difference is between a decentralized versus a centralized system. For the purposes of this presentation, we would like to envision both of these methods in terms of budget and coordination of services. A decentralized system means that every office or part of the organization is responsible providing their own accessibility options. A centralized system means there is one office responsible for the whole entity. There is a designated budget for allowing accommodations. Now, some places do have a hybrid approach. They may have a center for coordination of services, but the budget is handled by individual departments. Our goal is to show the benefits of a centralized system for both budget and coordination of services, especially for those occasional services such as interpreters, caption media, and so forth. So let me turn it back to you, Stephanie.
Okay, great. This slide is just showing you a real life example where a deaf student reached out to our center for support regarding their college access. In this situation, it looks like we're having a problem. One moment here. Okay. So in this situation, we pulled this clip from someone who reached out to us who wanted to participate in the campus ASL club. But they were told they were denied participation because the school did not have a budget to provide interpreters for them for ASL club. After doing some research, we found the school did have a centralized request procedure for all interpreting services. However, funding was dependent on each department and required student clubs and organizations to cover expenses. The ASL club's budget was not in a position to cover ongoing services, so the students had to fight for access. And eventually, the funds were made available and they were able to get interpreting services for ASL Club for their activities and events. So this is an instance where centralized funds would have been more appropriate and less of a burden on the students to have to fight for funding so that deaf students could access those events. We're going to emphasize this again and again throughout this presentation, but the institution as a whole is responsible to cover the cost for services, whether that be captioning, speech-to-text services, interpreters. That is not dependent on one single department or club budget to cover those costs. We really have to look at the institution as a whole, and the institution is who's responsible to figure out how to cover those costs. Let's look at the next slide. In this second scenario, I will explain what happened. A deaf student was taking all online courses through the community college and did not receive captioned videos to the pre-recorded lectures. So the student's access was limited. Now, typically access was provided, but it was done after those assignments were already due. So the student also had to take tests that included videos without captions. We learned through that the disability services at the school was not set up with a centralized protocol for captioning services. And it seemed to point fingers between faculty and the disability services office on who was responsible for making those materials accessible. So here we are seeing a system that would benefit from a centralized coordination of their caption media services. Again, the institution as a whole is who is responsible for ensuring access and should establish those policies and procedures that clearly outline the roles and responsibilities and how to reach out and partner with disability services and whose expectations lie in what place. So this is also a great example of when a system is more reactionary instead of proactively preparing for the deaf students' needs and that access. So many schools just simply aren't prepared to provide access. And we want to encourage you to proactively think about how you can improve coordination, how to have a budget ready for those services that we'll be coming across. Let's look at our next slide. So what I just showed you, hold on one moment. We are needing to move to the next slide. There we go. So again, these are real world examples from deaf students. Unfortunately, they are not isolated incidents. Many institutions are simply not ready to include deaf students on their campus, nor have they considered updating their policies and their practices to be more efficient to support deaf students. So we really encourage you to look over those items. For example, NDC did a survey of deaf students, and these are college students from across the country. And the students rated access at their campuses on these 6 different levels. The survey focused on how accessible their campus was and also identified common barriers and challenges. On average, the overall rating for institutions was a 3.2 out of 5. Now, if you're in school, you may know that's a D grade. I know that we can do better, right? We can do better. But that means we must make a commitment and a focused effort to improving the campus as a whole. And that won't happen through a single department like the Disability Services Office. Again, I can't emphasize enough that the responsibility must be dependent on the entire institution. And we also must continually emphasize that it's not just in the classroom, it's other activities, programs, courses, and events. Those all should be made accessible. So I want to just continue to emphasize the importance of that. And then our next slide is just a brief refresher on your legal responsibilities, which are, of course, important. Let's move on to the next slide.
Before we jump into the content here, I received a message in the chat that Zito's voice interpreter was having some audio difficulties, so they've asked me to please have a pause so we can correct it. Please let me know when we're ready to unpause. So I've just been informed we're good to go. Thank you all for your patience. Now, as a friendly reminder to people, when a system fails to provide equal opportunity, lawsuits and Office of Civil Rights investigations can happen. You all are probably familiar with the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Those laws make it very clear that all programs and services are important, regardless of whether they're public or private. In addition to the recent cases, such as the NAD v. Harvard and NAD v. MIT, it shows a shift of the focus being a more proactive, centralized process being established to address the gaps in current accessibility. For more information, we recommend that you review the information on the screen, which will provide you more details about institutional responsibility, what is the meaning of undue burden, what are some legal consequences and outcomes. Next slide, please. We're going to present our second poll. Before we do launch it, I would like to explain what we mean by each of these responses. For question one, the first part of poll 2 talks about budget structure, a centralized budget where one fund pays for it all. Partially centralized budget, meaning perhaps you have dedicated funds that will cover only specific services, for example, maybe caption media services. Everything else perhaps may not be covered depending on which departments they are falling under. Or a decentralized budget, meaning that each department, club, individual has their own budgets and are responsible providing all of these services. In the second question of poll 2, talks about the coordination of services structure. Is there a centralized coordinating system for the whole campus, a partially centralized coordination system, which would mean that some services have to be coordinated through a specific office, whereas other services do not, or a centralized coordination system where the same thing is happening in terms of each department is responsible to coordinate all their own accessibility. So if we could please launch the poll.
Okay, while we are answering that poll, I would like to let everyone know that we will share the PowerPoints with all of the different, with all the attendees after. So you'll receive this within the next day or two of this presentation. It will have all of the links in the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to access everything that we have here today. I just wanted to take this opportunity to let you all know that.
There we go. Interesting. So in terms of question number 1, budget, seems that most of you have a partially centralized budget. And for question 2, coordination of services, mostly it's close, either partially centralized or fully centralized, for both. Okay. A few decentralized. Thank you for those answers. We hope this presentation will inspire people to start thinking about establishing a goal to have both their budgets and coordination of services centralized. Next slide, please. Now we'd like to talk a little bit about what would be involved with each approach, centralized versus decentralized. So first of all, we're going to be addressing gaps rather, talking about unexpected needs that might arise. If you have a centralized system, you have that process in place and you're not working as hard trying to get access or putting the burden on the student. Now, needs may change over the years, but they can be anticipated because access issues will come up not only for deaf students, but for deaf staff, campus visitors, and so forth. In terms of knowledge, outside of the Disability Services Office, what we find is that a lot of departmental staff lack the knowledge and don't understand the nuances of appropriately coordinating access service. With a centralized system, you will have a one-stop shop on campus, which is designed to manage and facilitate requests via staff who have the correct knowledge and skills to coordinate said services effectively. Zito?
Yes, in regards to procedures, it can be challenging to get on the same page and have those streamlined procedures, policies, and practices. In a decentralized system, we often see finger pointing and misunderstandings as to who is responsible to provide what. It's not clear who is responsible to pay or who's responsible to handle the request. And again, like Zainab just mentioned, there are people who aren't familiar with the processes required to provide services. And sometimes it may happen so infrequently that staff isn't familiar, or there may be high staff turnover. And so whoever's in the office at the moment may not be familiar or knowledgeable with providing services. So consider the ongoing investment needed in that decentralized system, having to retrain staff members after turnover or updates to your existing policies and procedures, compared to having the campus-wide level centralized system. It's really important to think about those one-stop centers for access needs and how you can be proactive with those. Zainab?
This is Zainab. In talking about accountability ends up varying within a decentralized system. There are often gaps in oversight. Departments typically have angst about providing accommodations because their concern is how to meet their own departmental budgets, or if the staff are not familiar with the ADA or Section 504 requirements, they may not realize they do have a responsibility to provide these accommodations. Whereas in a centralized system, access is prioritized, and it's prioritized for the whole institution, and compliance, legal compliance, tends to be addressed. We are also seeing that having a centralized system, establishing one more proactively in your campus plan helps. For example, anytime there's renovations or events, you can save money for your institution because you don't have to retrofit the access at a later time. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I want to touch on the high cost of providing services in a decentralized system because it tends to duplicate efforts. When it's decentralized, one particular center may not realize that services are already being provided from another. So, an example we see often here is with captioned media. Definitely consider having captioned media become a centralized effort across your campus because that impacts your campus as a whole, not simply one particular curriculum, but think about marketing for your campus or your institution. Think about advertising for events or offering captions for events. This could touch on things that happen across your entire campus. Also, consider the captioning efforts for social media. Do your platforms have captioned content that you're posting? You know, it often happens that we see a duplication of efforts when there are decentralized systems because people aren't aware of where to find media that is already captioned. It may be available even there on campus, and another department may not be aware it's there. So think about the time, the expense, the effort, and not just the expense and cost, but in staff time. And the investment is high with a decentralized system. That could be greatly reduced if you centralize that and make it a coordinated effort. It could be as simple as an instructor needing something to be captioned, going to this centralized place and finding that it has already been done. Also, think about multiple software that must be purchased. If every department is responsible for their own way to caption, even if you have one particular software you use or you contract with a vendor, consider again the reduction in cost when everyone is sharing that software license or that agreement with the contractor. Whenever you have to update the software, which happens often, think about again the reduction in time and cost when that decentralized system becomes centralized. It definitely becomes more efficient, and saves time and money.
Quality control is another area where a decentralized approach would not work well. Considering the time, effort, the work invested into training staff as to how to caption, educating the faculty as to what the difference is from automated captions and live captions. We do not recommend relying on the faculty to caption their own videos, I will say, because they typically are not aware of captioning standards or how to caption appropriately. They would need training And they often don't realize the amount of time that it actually takes to caption a video, which could be a big burden on them in terms of the other duties they have as well. Next slide, please.
Yeah, if you don't mind, go back one more slide. I just want to mention some strategies with caption media. You can build the captioning in-house into your in-house procedure. For example, some of you may be familiar with the caption media process already. Previously, a person had to manually type out the captions or transcribe in order to get captions ready for a particular video. But as of late, technology has definitely improved, and automatic speech recognition, what we call ASR technology, has greatly improved so that you can already have a rough transcript written that comes from ASR so that then it can be handed over to a human to clean up and get ready for the captioning. It reduces a lot of time when it comes to having to transcribe an entire document. It's also an excellent idea for student work or interns to be able to clean up transcripts. If they receive a bit of proper training, then they can learn how to edit and clean up transcripts to prepare for caption files. And that can be a very low cost. So just remember, automatic speech recognition alone is not sufficient. It is not considered an equitable accommodation, but it is a great tool to use for that first draft or that first transcript. It looks like we're still having some microphone issues, so we're going to pause for a moment and talk with our technical team to see if we can get that worked out. All right, let's move to the next slide now.
All right. Oh, thank you for expanding on the information. So now let me talk about this slide. In a perfect world, it would be nice if each institution could have staff of interpreters, of speech to text writers, working in a caption media center that would deal with all their needs in-house. However, we recognize that that model may not be as facile, and it will depend on the size of your institution, the number of deaf students and staff you have on your campus, as well as other considerations. So whatever you have the capacity to provide in terms of in-house access, whether it be interpreters or captioning, your institution could still benefit from a centralized budget system, and the efforts for all the accessibility approaches would be dealt with. So we wanted to share some ideas as to when we look at in-house services versus outsourcing them, yet still having a centralized coordination approach. Zito?
Yes, so I'm first going to talk about in-house service providers. For example, there could be staff interpreters and staff speech-to-text providers who could be assigned other duties. They have industry knowledge, so they could coordinate services on campus. They could train as dual service providers. For example, I used to work in the college and university setting, and I personally am a certified interpreter and also a C-print captioner. And that is something I encourage staff to be able to provide both of those services. Staff can also assist with the captioned media process, creating and reviewing transcripts, editing those transcripts. Also, have staff service providers assigned for more dedicated assignments. For example, internships and study abroads and other opportunities that may require more of a full-time investment. Also, we all understand that your needs may fluctuate from year to year. Services could also be contracted out to nearby institutions or other institutions within your larger system. And that could be an opportunity to bring in money to your campus as a fee for service. Having services on the ground, so to speak, there on campus and available can be great for last minute requests and reduce your need for outside contracts for those to fill those last minute requests. So there are a lot of pros for providing in-house services. Zainab?
When we talk about outsourcing services, interpreting agencies can bring industry knowledge to provision of these services if you do not have in-house staff who are knowledgeable in that area. It also means there would be less investment of software, equipment, training of individuals in terms of different accessibility technologies, which you could outsource with a central contract to a central agency who would then provide said services. Also, there may be opportunities available to contract with other nearby campuses that do have staff. If you don't have the capacity in your own institution or a large number of deaf students and staff or community members who may need ongoing services, you can then partner with another local institution that does have the capacity. So there are a few pros in taking this approach. Zito?
Now let's talk about captioned media services in-house. When it comes to having centralized services, like we looked at here on the previous slide, there is a substantial cost saving that can be built into internal caption media processes. In-house caption media services have more quality control for accuracy and captioning standards versus relying on outside vendors who may not have that same level of training. So you can provide quality control. Also, there is a fee-for-service opportunity that could bring in money by contracting with other institutions who may not have the capacity to provide their own in-house caption service. Zainab?
So when we talk about outsourcing caption media services, you could perhaps negotiate with a vendor for a bulk discount. This is one possible approach. If you centralize your contract and request procedure, that could decrease costs because you would not then need to invest in the staff and training software and so forth. Teaching folks to caption in-house would be unnecessary. So there are potential partnership opportunities, as was previously explained, for caption media. You could have partnership opportunities by contracting to another local institution. There may be more cost savings than using them than a private vendor. Zito?
Perfect. Next slide, please.
So I've talked about the different centralized approaches. And so now we need to make a plan. When thinking about your particular context, think about brainstorming who the key players would be from your campus. Who should be involved in developing this process from the beginning? Who should be involved in your task force, advisory council? We're now going to briefly open the chat box. If folks could please share some ideas of who are the stakeholders, the key players from your institutions you feel should serve on this task force or advisory council, so we can share some ideas together. Okay, the chat box is open. I see fiscal department, HR, disability services, purchasing, IT, finance, faculty, administration, deaf and hard of hearing students. I see a lot of consumer representatives. Yes. Great. There's a lot of great ideas here.
I know, keep them coming.
Yes, and thank you for all of these wonderful ideas. Some additional people to consider including, let me share some that have already been mentioned, a few have not. An ADA committee person, ADA/504 coordinator. That's something that the NAD represented, yay NAD. Deaf faculty and staff, students, some people did say that. They are key parties in this. Service providers, such as interpreters, cart writers, agencies, contractors, local deaf services agencies serving as a consultant, IT, library, curriculum centers. I saw somebody in the chat saying cultural mediators. Yes. So you have to think about what your goal is, the aim for having a centralized budget system, centralized coordinating system, or both. You need information. You need perhaps data on accommodation requests, the costs, gather feedback from the deaf consumers in the situation about the process, get feedback from faculty and staff. So you have to think about the kind of data you would like to collect. That is an important part of creating a bona fide campus-wide plan, and developing a communication plan will basically guarantee that the policy is communicated across your campus. You can check with other institutions who have a similar goal and ask for a copy of their policies. Make some comparisons, make some changes, and when you're ready to disseminate it, roll it out with the support of the top administrator, your president. Getting commitment from your chancellors and provosts are critical for a cohesive transition. Zito?
Next slide, please.
I want to provide some resources about centralized services. If you are a member of AHEAD, I recommend that you review their biennial survey data on office structure and programs. This includes information on budget sizes, budget types, centralized versus decentralized, coordination of services, and even more. So AHEAD's research specifically acknowledged a trend in advocating for centralized budget lines for accommodations. So it's becoming more and more common across the nation. We can also look here at more captioned media trends. We're seeing more and more reports from colleges and universities on how they have benefited from that centralized budget approach for captioned media. Let's look at the next slide. I also want to share a little bit about what NDC can offer. We have a few guidelines, evaluation tools, and e-learning courses. One of the e-learning courses is Improving Campus Access. We also have a Disability Services Professionals Toolkit. And we do research-based practice for designing accessible environments. So these are great tools that you could bring to your task force to look at and talk about where you could at least get started on your campus and set some target goals, whether if it has to do with budgets or requests or both, ideally, right? So we have a little bit of time remaining. So during that time, we will take your questions. With that, let's look at the next slide. Okay, let's look here at the Q&A. We will post that up here. Okay. All right, I will go ahead and sign the question that's here on the slide deck. Coordination for students and employees at my college are separate. How do you navigate blending the two roles and fostering HR to see the value of providing accommodations for employees? Zainab, would you like to start with this?
Sure. I actually see two separate questions. I think first is convincing HR to see the value of providing accommodations for employees. Value and legal obligation, I will add. The institution has a legal obligation to provide accommodations for employees. So if they are not doing that, they could be found to be in violation. From the employee could file suit against them. And that's something we want to avoid. So the argument, that is the argument to use to convince HR. Now, how to navigate perhaps blending the two roles. I think it relates to the tips that we shared earlier. Gathering stakeholders together who can then brainstorm. You can't just start this kind of process overnight. You need to bring stakeholders together, develop a plan. And as we have been explaining in this presentation, having it centralized rather than decentralized has so many benefits. By bringing your stakeholders together, you can then together decide which approach would be best for you. Because a centralized approach doesn't work for everybody. It really relates to your institution's needs and perhaps a hybrid approach. You need to bring the players together to the table, deaf and hard of hearing stakeholders, and then talk about how these roles can be blended. Zita, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I was wanting to consider too the cost savings part, because I have noticed often with decentralized services, HR employees, and then student needs being decentralized, there's an overlap. Like if there is a campus event, it may be something where both entities plan for access. One is planning for the employees who will be attending, the other is planning for students, and then that becomes a duplication of cost and efforts. Also, especially if there are staff interpreters or speech to text providers, then I recognize that HR typically will contract with outside providers for their employees. But if there is staff available, it can be cost saving to use those staff as providers instead of only relying on outside contracts. Also, having staff to rely on to provide services to both students and employees, that those interpreters are more knowledgeable with campus structure, how the system works, the employees' policies and procedures. They have all of that knowledge. And when you bring in an outside contractor, it can present more of a challenge. Now, we do have resources that really explain why the use of consistent interpreters is important. And that's important for any type of service provider. There are many positives to providing those centralized services in cost savings and efficiency.
And not just efficient, but it avoids duplication of services, which is part of the efficiency, yes, but there's better oversight. You can have a full picture of everything that's going on for both students and employees in this manner. That's a good question.
Yes, that's a great question too. Let's do a quick check to see if we have other Q&A here. Okay, do we need to move to the next slide? I think we're waiting for the question. There we go.
So I'll read the question. Which schools or campuses have centralized budgets and coordination of services for both students and non-students? You're asking which schools now do have centralized systems for both budget and coordination and for both student and employee.
We have seen several, and I would have to think about who did both at the same time. I think it's a great question where we could follow up with a list of information and contacts with other institutions who have been through this. It may help you to develop your networks with other schools. We do have a disability services working group where other people in SSD services meet and talk about how to solve some of these problems. And I think this question would be best answered with a follow-up so that you can look at having that centralized system in place.
And if I may add here, I am hopeful that by the question, you wanting to know where the models are, meaning you are now thinking about, what could we learn from these models that we could then apply to our schools?
Yes, that's great. I do have a list of like caption media policies and things like that we can share. So that's a great question for the NDC help team. We can send you contacts with other institutions who have been in your same situation as well as some of these policies. Okay. Let's look here to see if there's another question. I don't think we have any other questions for now. Let's go ahead and do the final poll question.
Okay, so before we wrap up our presentation today, we're curious. We want to get a sense of where do you all feel you need the most support in terms of your own institutional needs? Please choose one or two of the following, and let me read the choices to you. Centralized budgeting, centralized coordination of services, developing campus policies, establishing a task force or committee, hiring staff service providers, establishing an in-house captioning media program, or other. So let's launch poll number 3, please. Great. Thank you for answering that question. Apparently, our largest number says they need support in developing campus policies. I would say, secondly, centralized coordination of services. Thirdly, centralized budgeting, which is very close to establishing an in-house captioning media program. After that, it's a little bit of a blend of establishing the task force or committee and hiring service providers. Okay, so the top answers are very interesting. It seems there's an interest in centralized budgeting and coordination, and people are enthusiastic to go with that. So we are quite hopeful. Zita?
Yes, that's right. Okay. So that's great. Let's look at the next slide here. So I want to take the opportunity to remind you that we are here for you. We can help support you in your efforts to centralize your system. And the best way to reach out is help@nationaldeafcenter.org. In the few minutes we have remaining, we're going to open the chat box. And if there is anyone else who already has centralized at least some of their services on campus, feel free to share what you've done. Maybe identify yourself and your name and what institution you're at, maybe what you have centralized at your school. And that way you can share your contact information with each other and get in touch with each other as well. We will be here for a few more moments, so go ahead and type your information if you're willing in the chat. And I also want to thank my co-presenters Zainab for being here with us today and providing such phenomenal support on this critical topic for deaf success. Deaf students must have access to their college and university experience to have that success.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for holding this event. And I also would like to thank the audience for being here. By being here, you are showing interest and enthusiasm on such an important topic. So thank you.